I love monster movies. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved and sometimes loathed creature features. Be it aliens, cyborgs, robots, monsters, I loved it. So much so that in junior high, I did a review of the original 1933 King Kong for art class. And a few years later in high school, for a video project, my friends and I made a commercial for Mega Raid. We ran across a cheap blue screen that showed us in stock video footage of Mogra or some other obscure 60s monster. Then we pitched a can of Mega Raid to help get rid of your monster problem. Originally, the stock footage would roll, and then we would pitch the product, and then the footage would reverse. But that proved to be too long for the project, and isn't the reason why we're here. So let's chow down on Godzilla 1984. Godzilla 1984, or also known as The Return of Godzilla, was released in Japan in 1984 and followed up with a North American release 1 year later. The first in what is regarded as the second series of the Godzilla franchise, Godzilla returns to wreak havoc on Tokyo and does so alone, unlike in previous films. Growing up in Canada, it wasn't easy to come across Godzilla films, but Godzilla 1984, or 85 depending on the rental store, always stood out to me when our family would rent movies from our local video store. There was just something about that cover art that grabbed my attention. A menacing dragon-esque monster standing over top of a partially destroyed city with planes and helicopters racing towards it. My childhood mind was convinced I had to see it. Unfortunately, my mom's adult mind was convinced that I shouldn't see it, and we probably rented something more age-appropriate like The Cat from Outer Space. It would be a few years later when I was old enough to stay up late that I caught about 30 minutes of Godzilla's initial attack when it was aired on a local TV station one Saturday night. That viewing cemented two cliches in my mind about giant monster movies in general and Godzilla movies specifically. First, no matter how large that monster is, it can always sneak up on someone and appear out of nowhere. And second, all Godzilla films feature someone running away screaming, "Godzilla!" with bad dubbing. Well, I'd like to say there isn't much more than Godzilla appearing and wrecking stuff, but for a man in a rubber suit smashing buildings kind of movie, there actually is a lot more going on. I should warn you, there are spoilers coming ahead. The film opens up with some pretty cool stock volcano footage. The volcano wakes up Godzilla, who's been sleeping in the ocean, I guess. At the same time, a fishing boat gets blown off course during a storm. A giant sea lice gets aboard and kills all but one of the crew members. A reporter stumbles across the wrecked ship and helps a survivor get to shore. Japan starts preparing for the inevitable invasion of Godzilla, and during this time, he encounters and sinks a Soviet nuclear submarine. And now the freaking Russians are involved. With the Soviets ready to declare war on Godzilla, the Americans feel obligated to join the party and bring the Cold War to Japan. Eventually, he makes his way to Tokyo Harbor. The Russians decide not to attack, however, when Godzilla shows up, he damages the boat, sending signals to the satellite that the missiles are on. This causes an inadvertent launch, and eventually the Americans shoot down the errant missile. While the Soviets and Americans posture, Godzilla tromps through Tokyo. In contrast to the original 1954 movie, Godzilla is dwarfed by giant skyscrapers and squares off against the X-1, a hovering weapons platform that fires cadmium shells into Godzilla's mouth and incapacitates him. But when a nuclear lightning bolt strikes Godzilla from a storm created by the exploded missiles, he wakes up and is ready to rampage. Fortunately, a scientist discovers that Godzilla navigates by following birds. Yeah, weakest plot point of the movie. And that's saying a lot. They lure Godzilla to the volcano with the bird calls, and when he's close enough, they detonate charges in the ground and he falls into the volcano. Whew. What a mouthful. It's important to note that the original 1954 film was inspired by the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Godzilla represents a destructive force that is nearly invincible and unstoppable, and serves as a fantastical way of remembering the destruction and loss of life less than 10 years prior. After the first film, the feel and tone of the movies definitely shifted towards fun and catered towards kids. When The Return of Godzilla came out 40 years later, its tone had become much more serious. Or as serious as you can make a monster movie with a guy in a rubber suit, as an entire subplot revolves around the threat of nuclear war. It's this kind of allegory that skews the film from being a great B movie into being a bad A movie. Most B movies have some kind of overly generalized morality built into it that helps drive the plot. Something that audiences can identify with without having to spend too much time thinking, like, war is bad and will bring unstoppable destruction. I'm sure the concept of mutually assured destruction was on people's minds when the Russian-American conflict was written into the plot. You could interpret the conflict between the Soviets and the Americans coincides with the appearance of Godzilla, and it's not until the conflict is over that Godzilla can be destroyed. There's your allegory for the Cold War, folks. Mutually assured destruction can't assuredly be stopped until the conflict is over. And that's where you get into that A-movie territory, trying to be a little bit subtle, but it doesn't quite come across here. And that's why I see this as a great B movie and not a bad A movie. As I mentioned before, when I saw the movie as a kid, several things were cemented into my mind about monster movies. First, Godzilla can sneak up on you at any point and you'll never notice him until it's too late. I mean, he's at least 400 feet tall. How do you miss it? To my knowledge, this was the first time that we saw the perspective of people running away from Godzilla that was not just running past low-angled cameras. The main characters are escaping from a damaged high-rise, something we'll see years later in the Cloverfield series. There's also a large crashing sound when Godzilla walks, and it reminds me of Jurassic Park. The miniatures and photography are generally good for that era of filmmaking. Godzilla's face is also a little more fierce, and is much more expressive. One of my favorite shots is when Godzilla walks by a giant mirrored skyscraper. It's all done in camera, and so the suit is reflected. There are sometimes, however, when the perspective doesn't seem to match the scale. For instance, when Godzilla attacks the nuclear power plant, a worker literally almost walked into him. The camera pans up and there he's looking about 20 feet tall. But in the other scene, his foot crushes houses. Speaking of feet, they made large-scale props which match the scale of Godzilla, but they move pretty mechanically, and it's really easy to notice. My biggest criticism is that the pacing is a little slow. But you almost forget about that when Godzilla uses his atomic breath and blasts a hole through a skyscraper. Yeah, that's what you came to watch the movie for. Not this Cold War allegory, but the monster movie mayhem, and that gets served up lots in this movie. Overall, Godzilla 1984 is a great monster movie, and it's one of my favorites in the franchise. It's a grade A slice of Gorgonzola for the B-movie classic, Return of Godzilla. My name is Ryan, thanks for watching, and remember, you can't spell cheese without a B.